sports are really important vehicles for relationships.
We have purpose. We have a why. We bring people together. We connect.
I feel like God is our greatest supporter and our greatest coach.
Welcome to Rabbi on the Sidelines. This is Rabbi Sherman from Sinai Temple in Los Angeles. It is Super Bowl week, and there is no better person to speak to about the Super Bowl and faith and football than Gary Myers, the author of this new book, Once a Giant, A Story of Victory, Tragedy, and Life After Football. Gary is a former New York Daily News and Dallas Morning News NFL columnist, author of 6 books, including Brady versus Manning. We're going to talk about maybe Mahomes as well. Cast of HBO's Inside the NFL and Yes Network's This Week in Football, and a voter for the Professional Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio. Gary, it's so great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us.
It's great to see you, Rabbi. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. So before we talk about LT and Sims, let's talk about Brady and Manning, and let's add Mahomes. Is there a third chapter to that story? Where does Mahomes fit into the Brady and Manning story?
Well, I think it's a little premature right now, just in terms of historically where he's going to fit in. He's a young guy. And let's keep in mind, he's won 2 Super Bowls and Brady won 7. So he's got a long way to go to catch up. But, you know, if he stays healthy, he's got a long way to go in his career. So you don't know what's going to be in 15 years from now if he's able to keep this going. But, you know, certainly he's off to a great start. Sunday, if he wins, it gives him 3 championships already, which, you know, moves him ahead of Peyton and Eli and Elway and some others, and puts him only behind Brady, Bradshaw, and Montana. So he's starting to work his way up the list of great quarterbacks in NFL history.
And talking about the Chiefs, I have a lot of Bar Mitzvah students who are Swifties, but also Kelsey fans. Tell us about the Taylor Swift phenomenon in the NFL. Has that hurt the NFL? Has it helped the NFL? It seems like a lot more younger people in the music world are now watching football these days.
Yeah, I can't see how it possibly has hurt them, because, you know, just some things that you read and you hear, it's bringing a lot more eyeballs to the game. These Swifties who wouldn't necessarily be interested in watching an NFL game and now watching, obviously, the Kansas City Chiefs games to see how many times they can put Taylor Swift up on the screen during the game. But that could eventually lead to them watching non-Kansas City Chief games because they become interested in just watching football. So I've seen some outrageous dollar figures about the revenue that her interest in the Chiefs and the NFL has brought to the league. I don't know how you possibly quantify that at this point, but I think it's only good things that are happening to the league because of her interest in it and her involvement.
So let's get into the Giants, 1986 Giants. I was 4 years old at the time, but I do remember LT towards the end of his career. You're a Syracuse grad. Take us to your journey into the world of the Giants before you get to 1986.
Yeah, I went to the Newhouse School at Syracuse, and I worked for the Associated Press right after I graduated, and I did a year at the Daily News. I actually did the Daily News twice, but I did a year at the Daily News very early in my career, and then got this tremendous job offer to go cover the Cowboys for the Dallas Morning News.
Oh, nice.
And it was right in the middle of, or the beginning really, of this incredible newspaper war between the Morning News and the Dallas Times-Herald, and the Cowboys were the most important beat on the paper, on the entire paper. The war, so to speak, and I use that loosely, you know, to talk about a newspaper competition, but the battleground was really the Cowboys. So I really appreciated having such an incredibly important job during a very important period of time for the newspapers in that town, but also for the Cowboys, because I was able to be there and chronicle the last 8 years of Tom Landry. And I overlapped by a few months with Jerry Jones and Jimmy Johnson. Then I had an offer to come back to New York to be the NFL columnist for the Daily News. When I was at the Daily News the first time, I was just covering the Giants. Now they brought me back as a columnist. It was at that time I also got the job at HBO, being our inside information reporter for Inside the NFL. Will McDonough from the Boston Globe was the first newspaper guy who crossed over to doing television work. And I was the second. And now, between Adam Schefter and Ian Rappaport and all these other guys, everybody has their own insider. But at that point, I was really the second guy to do it. And then I went from there to doing This Week in Football on the Yes Network, which is the regional cable outlet here in New York that does the Yankee games. And I left the Daily News in 2018 as the newspaper started to crumble. And I've really just concentrated on writing books, since then. Once a Giant is my latest one. Although the Brady versus Manning book was a Times bestseller, this one is my best book by far. And it's been so well received, not just by Giant fans and New York football fans, but around the country. Because it transcends just being about the Giants, and it transcends just being about sports, because it's about life after football, how these players have dealt with the challenges of playing such a violent sport. People say it's a contact sport, Rabbi. It's not. It's a collision sport. It's a car wreck on every play. And there's, physical price to pay for that. And the league is trying to get better now with the concussion protocols and all. There's no getting away from the fact that it's really hard to legislate against it being such a high impact sport played by players who are getting bigger, faster, and stronger. So I want to tell the story of that generation of players and how they're doing in their life after football. It's filled with a lot of heartbreaking things, but a lot of heartwarming stories as well about the brotherhood they formed in '86 and how that brotherhood and that bond is still really strong and intact today.
Well, it's interesting that you say the average career is basically 3.5 years, but they have this brotherhood, intense brotherhood within that career. And then many times in the book, you say, or the players are quoted after you're interviewing them saying, "Would you do it again?" And they said, "Absolutely," which is a really interesting moment.
Yeah.
Knowing now, right? They didn't know the CTE and all these players with Bavaro and Carson. They went through really a lot of heartbreak after the fact. But then let's talk about Lawrence Taylor, because he goes through, I don't necessarily say heartbreak after, but he changes. It's almost in the, when it's in the Jewish tradition, a shinui, a change. And he goes, as your book says, from LT to Lawrence. How does he make that change? At what point does he realize, wow, I better wake up, otherwise I'm not going to last on this earth much longer? Tell us a couple of insights into the LT that we don't know.
Yeah, I mean, he was a wild man when he played, on the field and off the field. We never got to see the off the field stuff because his teammates didn't really get to see it because he didn't hang out with them because he was into different things. Well known that he had a horrible cocaine addiction that could have easily ended his career. After he tested positive for the first time in 1988, because the league only started testing in '87, he got suspended 4 games, and he didn't test positive again for the rest of his career. Whether he was cheating the system or he actually stayed clean, I don't know. But I know that, for a while there, until he tested positive, he was cheating the system because teammates have told me that they switched their own urine samples with Lawrence's, or LTs in those days. So he was able to test negative and stay on the field. And so in his post-career life, starting in 1994, he was a mess. He kept getting arrested for cocaine-related issues and in and out of rehab centers. And finally, in 1998, he went to a rehab center in Jersey and says he hasn't done cocaine since then. And his teammates have backed him up on that. I'd like to believe it's true, but I'm sure you've dealt with addictions of some of your congregants and maybe advised them. And for those who are addicted, whether it's drugs or alcohol, they're never cured. They're always recovering addicts, and it's day to day. And although Lawrence has said he's been clean for now, it's going on, more than 25 years. And I met with him in Florida to interview him for the book. He was happier and healthier than at any point that I had seen him since he had retired. Now, that's not to say during those years in between, he didn't get himself into trouble, and he did with alcohol and with women and things of that nature. But his name has not been in the news for the wrong reason for
Right.
about 5 years. I think he finally realized that if he did want to keep living, he was going to have to, as he says, bury LT and go back to being Lawrence. And from all indications, that's what it's been the last 5 or 6 years. And knowing him as well as I do, and for as long as I have, I'm rooting for him, which that doesn't mean that I've condoned any of the bad stuff that he's done, because not only has he hurt himself, he's hurt others. But if he's got himself straightened out, is living his life the right way, I think everybody knows him is rooting for that to continue.
So one LT question before we transfer to Phil Simms and how that sort of dichotomy or chemistry actually worked. It seems like reading this book that sometimes there are different rules for a player like LT because you're going to get the W's than for other players who, the linemen that need to show up and do their job, but it doesn't happen without them as well. Does that happen in the NFL? It's not college athletics. This is professional. It's a business. At the end of the day, the coach is on the sidelines when the team wins.
So you're talking about whether there's a double standard or not?
Perhaps, yeah. Like, right, when you have the All-Star, the Pro Bowl, any sport, right? If they can get you the win, maybe we can look back, look past the foibles.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's on different levels. Jimmy Johnson once told me a story that after he cut a player for falling asleep in his team meeting, I mean, he basically tapped him on the shoulder, woke him up, and said, "You're out of here."
We do that for after sermons too.
So he told me that if it was Troy Aikman that fell asleep in his meeting,
right,
go over to him, tap him on the shoulder, and said, Troy, please wake up." So yeah, I mean, depending on who you are, you get treated differently. But it's certainly a different situation when you're talking about a guy falling asleep in a meeting versus a guy who's got an addiction, and how far do you go in enabling him? And in the days before the NFL tested for drugs, Parcells was doing it on his own.
Right.
And I'm sure the league would not have been happy if he was doing that. So he was trying to, I mean, he knew which guys were doing drugs, and he was testing them as a means of trying to help them. And basically, reading them the riot act. If you don't get yourself straightened out, you're out of here. As far as Taylor is concerned, Bill has told me he really resents people thinking he enabled him and turned the other way just to keep him on the field, when he was the one who was encouraging and in many instances, setting it up for Lawrence to go to rehab.
Yeah, that's an interesting player-coach relationship there. And then you talk a lot about Bill Parcells, and I started reading this book as Bill Belichick was the Patriots coach, and I finished the book after Bill Belichick. And it's interesting, at the end of the book, you say Belichick really doesn't like to sort of speak about books, but then he gave you a 2,500-word essay. What's the give us a little insight into Bill Belichick and that successful Patriots run, but also why isn't he hired as an NFL coach today?
I'm shocked that he didn't get hired in this hiring cycle. I think owners are afraid of who he is and the power that he would demand. Although I think that was overstated, that at this point in his career, he just wants to coach. He wants to pass Don Shula. He needs 15 more victories. He wants to win a Super Bowl without Tom Brady, to kind of flip the narrative back a little bit, because Brady winning one without him has led people to believe that everything that happened to New England was Brady, not Belichick, which I don't think is fair, and I don't think it's accurate. Belichick learned how to coach when he was with the Giants. I mean, he learned how to be a great coach when he was with the Giants. Just a brilliant defensive coordinator. He had to win the players over when Parcells promoted him from a special teams and linebackers coach to the defensive coordinator, because, the players are going, and Parcells had been the defensive coordinator, and the players saying, this guy never played before. What is he going to teach us? And then they realized how brilliant he was and how he's going to help win games, which resulted in them getting better contracts and making more money. So they love Belichick. It's interesting how much success he had in New England because his personality that we saw publicly was pretty much how he was with his players.
Mm-hmm.
And but they responded to him and they played hard for him. And he had the benefit of having a player who he developed from a 6th-round pick who was totally overlooked in the draft into the greatest quarterback and probably the greatest player in NFL history in Tom Brady.
Mm-hmm.
So the Patriots were very lucky for 2 decades to have the greatest player and the greatest coach in NFL history together in their primes, winning 6 Super Bowls. And that'll never happen again.
So I want to talk about mental health. Oh, sorry, there's a little echo. Mental health in football. It really wasn't spoken about for years, and now mental health is at the forefront of sports, of religion. Here at Sinai Temple, we actually have a mental health center where we say, no, you can come into a spiritual place and get the help that you need. And so many of these unbelievable athletes, 1986 Giants, it was just heartbreaking to read how one wants to drive off the Tappan Zee Bridge, another wants to take their life this way or that way. And the reason that they were saved is often, for instance, by their daughter who said, who am I going to live for?
Mm-hmm.
How has that transformed the NFL in terms of realizing that mental health needs to be a part of what the NFL can be in the moment and not just wait until after?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Each team now has their own player programs department, which not only includes, trying to help players post-career get jobs, making sure the transition is smooth, but providing a team psychologist for them to talk to and deal with any issues that they're having. So much more is known about it today than was known about it in the 80s and the 90s. The way the NFL is just dealing with concussions now is completely different with the concussion protocol. And if you suffer a concussion, it's likely, not only won't you play again in that game, that's for sure, but now it's likely you'll probably sit out 2 or 3 weeks. They say he got dinged or he got his bell rung. They'd bring him over to the sideline. It's not funny, but it's just so archaic that, they'd say, what's your name? Do you know what day of the week this is? Do you know what stadium we're in? And if they knew the answers to all 3 questions, okay, you can go back in the game. Even the guy would kind of be in his own world at that point. That has led to a lot of the mental health issues that players are going through today, because the cumulative effect of concussions can be very damaging. But there was a period of time in there that there were team doctors who believed that suffering a concussion didn't make you more susceptible to suffering the next one. So if you suffer a concussion in the first quarter and then the cobwebs, so to speak, cleared up by the third quarter, they put you back in.
Right.
I know of specific cases where that happened, and the guy went back in and suffered another concussion. So it was kind of barbaric when you get right down to it, how they treated these players. And not enough was known about it on the team level or the league level or even with doctors. And it certainly was to the detriment of the players. And the sad thing to me, Rabbi, about these players today who are now in their 50s and 60s is that their health insurance when they retired was 12 months. And maybe it increased to 18 months. Now it's 5 years, which is still completely insufficient, because say the average career ends at the age of 32. Chances are they're not having these major issues between the ages of 32 and 37. It's more likely to be between 52 and 57 or, into their 60s. So the league providing the health insurance for the first 5 years for today's players, to me is I won't say it's insignificant, because some of these guys will then have, major operations done that'll be covered. But the major issues really are not surfacing until, the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, when they might need a shoulder replaced or a knee replaced or a hip replaced, which unless they've then subsequently taken good jobs that have good health insurance, it can cause a lot of financial problems.
So somebody who has had an interesting career, not a story of tragedy, but more of victory, is Phil Simms. And then as he was traveling around, now he's in the studio. He said, I just couldn't get on those planes anymore. I'm, too old. I've had 10 neck surgeries. Take us through Phil Simms, how he meshed with LT to become that sort of duo, and then what his model of success is and how maybe more can get to that level.
Yeah, I mean, Phil had 3 back surgeries since his playing career ended and caused him an awful lot of problems. But as far as his relationship with Taylor, they were, as teammates, they loved each other. They appreciated each other. Lawrence always had a soft spot for Phil because Phil was so tough, and he had a linebacker mentality the way he played. They've played golf together a bunch of times, but as far as socializing, Phil told me a really funny story that I can't remember what year this was, but it was relatively early in Lawrence's career, that he goes up to Phil after practice and he says, "Hey, Simms, a bunch of us are going out after practice. You want to come with us?" And, Phil was married and had young kids, and he really had no desire to go out and hang out with Lawrence, knowing what, they'd probably be doing things that he wouldn't want to do. So he goes, I think I'll pass on this one, Lawrence. And Taylor looks at him and goes, "That was a very smart choice."
He knew himself.
Yeah. So as far as Phil's business model, what's really amazing is he retired after the 93 season. Now, he wanted to continue playing, but the Giants cut him.
Right.
He had a couple opportunities to continue playing in Cleveland and Arizona. It didn't match up. He's been on national television every year for 30 years. I mean, that's like Walter Cronkite-esque, who's on national television for 30 straight years?
Right.
And he's had a terrific career post-football, just in terms of how well he's done for himself. And he's a smart businessman. He's done a lot of good stuff, and he's also very philanthropic. Just a great guy. He's one of my favorite players I ever covered, and probably I've been covering the league. I've been around the league since 1978.
Wow.
There's maybe 2 or 3 guys that I've covered that I would consider to be friends. You always try to keep your distance anyhow, but Phil is definitely one of them. And out of everybody I've ever covered, he might be top of the list. He's just a great guy.
So when we're going to add the faith piece in just a moment here, because the very touching story that I read in the book, again, Gary Myers, Story of Victory, Tragedy in Life After Football, Once a Giant. If you haven't gotten this, definitely worth getting, especially Super Bowl week here. You're in the inside of the Giant story, 1986 championship. One of those stories was when LT was inducted into the Hall of Fame, and they had a falling out with Harry Carson, and so much that he did not invite him. But Harry Carson decided to show up no matter what. And afterwards, he asked, "What are you doing here?" basically. And Harry Carson says, "I'm here." And then they hug and they weep. It almost reminds me of the biblical story of Jacob and Esau when they reconnect as brothers. The Torah actually tells us that they hugged, and that led to that reconciliation. Take us to that moment, and why did Carson do that? And what did it mean to LT to have his brother from this team come and support him, even though they might have separated a bit?
Yeah, I mean, they were very close as teammates for 8 years. But Harry was also, very, very critical of Lawrence and the way he conducted his life off the field. Harry was the greatest leader on that team. There were others like Lawrence and George Martin and Phil Simms, but Harry was kind of the go-to guy for Parcells. And Harry considers himself captain for life, and he's always looking after his guys. They're always known as Parcells guys. You got anointed as being part of the club if you were a Parcells guy. But Harry says they were his guys too. And Lawrence was one of the guys that he tried to help a lot, and he was very disappointed with all the problems that Lawrence was getting into after his career was over, and he was critical. So when Taylor formed his invitation list for the Hall of Fame in 1999, he did not include Harry Carson. And Harry just basically says, "I don't care. I'm going anyhow." And when Lawrence is in the middle of a speech in Canton, and in those days it wasn't done in the stadium on a big stage, it was done on the steps of the hall,
Right.
and they set up rows and rows of chairs at the bottom of the steps, and Taylor's in the middle of his speech, and he sees Harry, and he goes, and there's Harry Carson. We've had our problems, but much respect to you, Harry, for showing up for me today. And then afterwards, the scene that you described, Rabbi, that they're in the hallway, and they see each other, and they just start hugging, and Harry's wife just walked off to the side to give them that moment together. And I mean, that was a very emotional moment for both of them. And they've been friends ever since. But you can only imagine that these two guys who won a Super Bowl together, who eventually both would be in the Hall of Fame because Harry got in about 7 years later, kind of a reconciliation without an explanation. Harry didn't say, "This is why I said what I said about you," and Lawrence didn't say, "Why were you bad-mouthing me?" Because he knew that Harry only had his best interests in heart, that he wanted Lawrence to live a long life.
Mm-hmm.
And if he was trying to shock him into it by saying critical things, then so be it. He didn't care, because he cared about Taylor as a person. And I think in that moment, by Harry showing up without an invitation and basically saying, "I'm just going. This guy was my brother on the field. I don't care that we haven't spoken in years. I'm just going to be there for him because I should be there for him with my other teammates." I think that meant an awful lot to Taylor, and the very hard exterior of Lawrence Taylor disappeared when he was hugging Harry in a place that very few people saw, because it was behind the scenes inside the Hall of Fame in the basement.
So for decades and decades, you have had insights into what a Hall of Famer is. And not only that, you have the responsibility and obligation to vote these people into the Hall of Fame. What does that look like? And then more ethical aspect, I know you wrote, or often in this book, that what happens off the field, it's only about what happens on the field. Maybe take us through. I've never spoken to somebody who votes in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. What does that process look like? Do you bring a list, and do they bring a list, and you compare a list? Are there check marks? And at what moment do you know that we probably also have people that are not in the Hall of Fame that probably could be in the Hall of Fame? There's just not enough spots. What does that look like in your responsibility?
Well, we have a committee of 50 people on the Hall of Fame selection committee. And we start off, and there's different categories: the modern era category, and the seniors, and the coach and contributors. The modern era candidates have to be out of the game for 5 years, and then they're eligible as a modern era candidate for 20 years. So at the beginning of the process each year, the Hall of Fame sends us a list, a ballot, and there's probably 80 names on it. And individually, we vote it down to 25. We each pick the 25 that we want to continue in the process. And then it's, they tally up the votes, and whoever's received the 25 who received the most votes make it to the next round. And then the next step is we vote it down to 15. And then once we get to 15 is when we have what had always been an in-person meeting up until 2021 with COVID. We got the 2020 meeting in about 2 months before COVID.
Wow.
And starting in 2021, we've been doing it virtually. So what happens is you have the 15 finalists that we voted down from that big list down to 25, down to 15. And then the Hall of Fame assigns one person to make the presentation for a candidate. So you have 15 people making the presentation. The way they assign it is, if there's a New York Jet that's up for election, I make the presentation. If there's a New York Giant, there's somebody else in New York that does it. And with the Rams, there's somebody in Los Angeles. So the person makes the presentation. Then anybody can speak up on a candidate after that presentation is made. And we go through the list of 15, and the arguments can last, or the discussion can last 3 minutes, can last 30 minutes, it can last an hour and 20 minutes, just depending on how many people want to speak up and basically, if it's a controversial candidate or one that is borderline, it'll lead to longer discussion. And so then we voted from 15 down to 10, and then we voted from 10 down to 5. And then once we get to 5, it's a yes or no.
Wow.
And in most cases, all 5 will get in. Then at that point, they're not competing against each other. It's just yes or thumbs up or down on each of the 5. And at the NFL Honors, which is now on Thursday nights, the Super Bowl week. So depending on when people are going to watch this, tonight they'll announce it at NFL Honors.
Oh, nice.
Who the 5 are, in addition to the senior candidates who got in and the coach contributor. So I've kept a pretty good secret for 3 weeks now.
Oh my gosh, wow. This is live right now. So Gary Myers has all the secrets right here. We're going to watch that tonight. Oh my gosh, that's so exciting.
I'd love to be able to tell your audience who they are, except that then it would cost me my spot on the committee. So
probably my job at Sinai Temple. So we're going to keep that till Shabbat. Wow, that's amazing. Is there a player whose eligibility is no longer, so they're not eligible anymore, but who maybe you would have loved to see in the Hall of Fame?
Oh, I have a long list of that. But they never are not eligible, because once the 20 years have expired as a modern candidate, you're now a senior.
Oh, interesting.
Okay, so with the seniors, the pool is made up of basically every player in NFL history who's not in the Hall of Fame.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, everybody is not a Hall of Fame worthy player, so we start off each year with a senior list of about 150.
Mm-hmm.
And the process is exactly the same as I just told you. We voted down to 25, then to 15, and then to 10, and then to 5, and then we have 3 senior spots available each year. So players who are not in the Hall of Fame that I would have loved to have seen being, a guy like Carl Banks for the Giants, Leonard Marshall for the Giants, Everson Walls, who I got to know really well when I covered the Cowboys all those years. And then actually, I always tell him he followed me to New York, but he played for the Giants for a couple of years after I had moved back from New York. To me, he's a Hall of Fame worthy player, for sure. Joe Jacoby, who was an offensive tackle for Washington and started on 3 Super Bowl teams, basically a generation apart. There was one in 82, then 87, then 91. Played for the Hogs. Are we allowed to say Hogs in Temple?
We're virtual, so we'll be okay.
Yeah, okay. All right. So he started on those 3 Super Bowl teams, and he was the only one member of the Hogs offensive line that started on all 3 of them. And I think he's deserving. I think Phil Simms deserves to get in, and Jim Plunkett deserves to get in. Both Simms and Plunkett are the only quarterbacks who won 2 Super Bowls who are not in the Hall of Fame. So
I didn't realize that Sim was not in. Wow.
Yeah,
that's
so I think they deserve it. Yeah, and there are some coaches now. Mike Shanahan, Mike Holmgren for sure, and I think both of them will get in. Tom Coughlin, Dan Reeves, I'd like to see get in. But it's hard. I mean, there's so many qualified candidates and not enough spots. And unlike the Baseball Hall of Fame, which puts in 1, 2, or 3 every year, at least, and the football rosters are so much bigger, so you figure there's going to be more candidates. It's just hard to get in. But at least we try to put in, the 5 moderns and then the 3 seniors and then a contributor or a coach every year. Not every year, mainly with the modern era candidates. If they make it to the final 5, they're pretty much guaranteed of getting in. But there's been instances in the past where a senior has been voted down when all he has to do is get the yes or no, and the same thing with a coach or contributor. But, those situations don't happen that often.
So behind you, I see the poster of Once a Giant, but I also see it signed by Bill Belichick, and up top, it's Bill Parcells.
I'll tell you this. They didn't sign him. My son is very creative. he blew up the covers of my book, found the signatures on the internet,
Oh no.
and put them. Yeah.
Well,
I
have a
don't ask for
question.
autographs, so
I do have a question about Bill Parcells,
but,
basically this
okay.
Torah portion, and then one last question about faith in football.
I love how you're intertwining, the whole Carson Taylor reconciliation with something, historical Jewish history. I think that's pretty cool.
Well, as you learn in rabbinical school, everything can be a sermon. And actually, I tell athletes this as I talk to them, that what you do on the field does become our sermon, because it's the real lived experience, and adding that faith to it. And actually, I'll ask one faith and football question in a moment. But the Bill Parcells thing is interesting, because in this week's Torah portion, we learn about the commandment to give somebody a loan. And they talk about the difference between give somebody a loan and give somebody charity. That give somebody charity is when they're begging for something, and that's shameful for the person because it's embarrassing. But to give somebody a loan can actually turn somebody's life around. And there's a story here when I don't remember who it was, when Bill Parcells gives supposed to give a loan to somebody, and you write, they'll never pay it back because he's not expecting that. So he gives a loan not expecting that. And as you said, part of Parcells' sort of boys. It seems like when you're in that club, it's not just a football club, but it really is this brotherhood that in difficult times and good times, he'll have your back.
Yeah. I have to imagine, and Bill even said this, that he's like the last line of defense, or the last resort. Mm-hmm. If a player is having financial problems, they come to him, because how embarrassing it must be to go to your former boss and coach and say,
right,
coach, I really need help. I just can't make this mortgage payment, or I can't pay my doctor bills, or alimony, or taxes, or whatever the case may be. He just doesn't write checks to anybody. They have to explain to him how they got into the situation and what they need the money for. But he gives them the money unconditionally. And whether that would be a loan or charity, I'm not sure. You'd be better at maybe qualifying that or categorizing that than me. But he feels a sense of responsibility. Mm-hmm. And part of it is because he drove them so hard when he coached them. Those were the days when you're able to practice 2 days in pads every day in training camp. And Bill did that. It was the days when you can go in pads all the time during the season, and Bill would do that a couple of times a week. Now there's no 2 days anymore in training camp, and you can only practice in pads a couple of times a week.
Wow.
During the season, they don't even practice in pads every week. And so the constant contact in a collision sport, he knows has done damage to his players, mm-hmm. and has caused mental health issues and has caused physical issues. But there's nothing he can do about that now. It wasn't intentional. It was kind of the way the game was played then, and the way the game was coached. So if the way he can help them is financially, then he says he considers it his obligation and his responsibility to help them that way, knowing that because they bought into his program when he was coaching, that helped him turn him into a Super Bowl winning coach who made an awful lot of money in his career. So the way he explained it to me, Rabbi, is that he's taken the money that he feels he needs to live the rest of his life, and hopefully, he's 82. Right. Hopefully it's another 30 years. He's given money to his 3 adult daughters. He's taken care of his ex-wife, who he has a very good relationship with. And then he has money that he's set aside to take care of his friends. And he considers his former players his friends. He was their boss at one point, but now these guys are sending him birthday cards and Father's Day cards, whether or not, they're one of the players that Bill is helping out financially. They still feel that way about him, to get in contact with him on his birthday and Father's Day, which I think I just haven't heard that with any other coach. Mm-hmm. Nor have I heard any other coach who's given money to his former players. I've heard owners who've helped out their former players. All these guys are billionaires. Bill is very well off financially, but it's not like he's got $100 million or anything like that. But he's got enough that he wants to help these guys who helped him.
So last question before, I'm only a rabbi, and hopefully you'll be a prophet in terms of telling us what you're going to see this weekend in Vegas. But faith and football. And I asked a lot of people this. I know there's chapel. I know there's chaplains. But can you tell me a story that you've seen in the football world where faith was a component that either helped somebody on the field, off the field, or just where it was part of the game?
Wow. Well, I know there are a lot of guys who are really big on faith, big on religion. There's church gatherings a lot of times on Sunday mornings. They have chapel services on Sunday mornings at road games, and things of that nature. There haven't been a lot of Jewish players. I remember the 49ers were a favorite team of a lot of Jewish football fans for a while because they had John Frank, who was a tight end, and Harris Barton, an offensive tackle, both Jewish, and they played together. In fact, John Frank he was a very good player for the Niners. He ended his career early to go to medical school.
Wow.
I'm sure that made his parents very proud, as we know. Kurt Warner was probably the most religious player that I've come across. When he played for the Giants that one year, and about halfway through the season, Tom Coughlin decided to go with Eli Manning, who was a rookie. And so Kurt didn't have to do the media sessions that he would do when he was starting. I used to go sit and talk to him for a while, and invariably when I went and talked to him, he was just sitting there reading the Bible.
Wow, I love that.
Yeah, and so he would put it down for a while, and we would talk, and then when I'd leave, he'd go back, and he would do that.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, Kurt is a genuine guy, and a lot of good. I have to be honest with you. When you see these interviews after games, and I mean, I hope the audience takes this the right way, but when the first thing they do, they start thanking God or thinking who their God is or whatever. In my mind, I'm just going, save it. I don't want to hear that at that point. I don't know how you feel about that.
I asked a lot of my guests that over the years. Actually, Dave Sims, great broadcaster in the New York area.
Oh, I used to work with him at the Daily News. Yeah.
So Dave said on the interview, he said, I'm thanking God for the home run, but the guy in left field is not exactly thanking God for that ball going over the fence. So
yeah. I mean, I'd rather they not wear it on their sleeves as much as a lot of them do. I mean, that's
but
just
it seems like a lot of the stories after football, which you speak about in victory and tragedy, do have elements of faith that allow these men to go through challenges with the faith to continue as well. So,
absolutely. I mean, without question. And guys when they're at their lowest moment is when they always say they turn their life around because faith became a much bigger part of it. So I think it's a very key component for a lot of players. I mean, but just like any segment of society, there's a lot that don't care. And I think I wish I had some more like individual stories to tell you how it factored into guys' careers when they were playing, but I tended not to talk to them about that. And it came up in a lot of answers, and then I would have to make a judgment whether I felt it was pertinent to the story or not. But I think it is a key part of a lot of locker rooms, and it does form factions on teams where the guys who are really religious, tend to bond, over that. And
actually, in a couple of weeks, I have Kevin Jordan, who a former UCLA player, played in the NFL, was the chaplain of the Pittsburgh Steelers, and is now director of player personnel at UCLA. So I'm interested in how he literally brings faith to players. So I'm going to give you the report back then. So the Super Bowl is coming up in just days. Everybody's out in Vegas. The Hall of Fame announcement's going to be tonight. What do you expect come Sunday, and who's going to be going to Disneyland on Monday?
Yeah. The NFL would much prefer them go to Disneyland than one of the sports books. That's a whole other story. I like Kansas City in this game. They're playing their best football right now. They had a rough regular season for them. They were 11-6, but they beat Miami at home in the first round of the playoffs, but then really impressive victories at Buffalo and at Baltimore. I didn't think Kansas City was going to win either one of those games, but they're playing their best football now. Conversely, the Niners were the number 1 seed. They had the bye week, and they could have lost to Green Bay. They should have lost to Detroit. When you break it down, to me, it really comes to, who do you think is going to win this game, Patrick Mahomes or Brock Purdy? A guy who's starting to get into the conversation, elevating himself into, the greatest quarterbacks in NFL history, versus a guy who's a great story. Last pick in the draft in the 7th round, only in his second year, is so much better than anybody could have possibly imagined. But when you think about the stage on Sunday and the pressure that comes with playing in this game, I just have to think that Mahomes is going to have the better game. But I do want to put an asterisk next to that and say I am the absolute worst at picking games. And don't anybody dare bet on this game based on what I say. And I actually came up with this thought this morning. The Super Bowl that was played after the 2001 season, I think it was 38, but I'm not positive of the number, but it was the Patriots and the Rams, and it was the Super Bowl that came after. It was the season of 9/11, and that's what a lot of us remember that season for, especially here in New York. But that was Kurt Warner, who had already won a Super Bowl, against Tom Brady, who was in his second year and was a 6th-round draft choice. So I draw somewhat of a comparison. And Brady won that game, obviously. I'm not saying that's going to be the same. In fact, I don't think it will be the same with Brock Purdy beating Mahomes like Brady beat Warner. But it's and I'm surprised I really haven't read that comparison this week. The situations are very comparable, just in terms of the experience and the success of one guy versus the lack of experience, and to this point, just moderate success of the other guy.
Well, Gary Myers, author of Once a Giant, A Story of Victory, Tragedy, and Life After Football. I know the Hall of Fame inductions announcement will be tonight, but Gary Myers, the Hall of Fame of Rabbi on the Sidelines. I hope to have you back as I read Brady versus Manning. I'm excited to delve into that. You're really an amazing encyclopedia, not just of NFL facts, but insights into what this game is all about, what it represents in America, in the world, and also in the faith community as well. Gary Myers, so great to have you in Rabbi on the Sidelines, and we'll see you soon. Have a great day.
Thank you.